Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Tuesday, July 2nd, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking about the month of July and how it's probably going to be a pretty crazy run around college football, whether you're talking about conference realignment or recruitment or anything in between. There's going to be a ton of stuff to talk about this month, and I kind of want to break down some of the things that I'm really watching going into this month. Then we'll talk about Notre Dame and Marcus Freeman. It feels like everything is moving in the right direction up in Notre Dame. Obviously, they have done really good work in bringing in some really elite quarterbacks over the last couple of years. I think they're going to bring in even better guys over the next couple. So I want to break down that for you guys. Then we'll get into the playoff. We'll talk about how things could change very drastically if the SEC and the Big Ten do not necessarily get what they bargained for in this agreement and don't get a ton of teams into the playoff. I kind of want to break down what the monikers will be and how it could kind of change depending on how each conference goes about their business this year. Then we'll get into College Football 25. The overall rankings came out last Friday. I kind of want to break those down. I have some problems as I had problems with pretty much every other list that came out, but for the most part, they're relatively minor, except for just forgetting one team exists. But then we have a Top 10 Tuesday for you guys, and we're going to do the best games in Week 0 and Week 1 to get you guys a little bit primed for the season that is coming up very, very quickly. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always good for the both of us. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump in, and let's talk about this month of July that is coming up, because it's going to be pretty wild. It started yesterday with all of the conference realignment stuff officially taking effect. Texas and OU are officially in the SEC. Texas and OU had their little party in their football stadium for the event. Obviously, Oregon, Washington, USC, UCLA to the Big Ten, Colorado, Arizona State, Arizona, and Utah to the Big 12, and then Stanford, SMU, and Cal over to the ACC. So all of those got shifted just a little bit. All the Power 4 conferences are a little bit different today than they were 2 days ago, which is obviously something we've been kind of prepping for over the last couple of years, but I would be surprised if that was the biggest conference realignment news we got this month. I think there's going to be a ton of movement over the next little bit about what all is going to happen. Obviously, Texas and OU are just set up. They're in the SEC and they're comfortable there. I'm not sure everyone's super happy that they're there, but they are there for the foreseeable future. But there's going to be tons of stuff that happens around this sport and around conference realignment over the next couple of weeks. And the biggest one is obviously Florida State and Clemson. What happens with them? How quickly do they find their way out of the ACC? If they want to do it by 2025, they likely need to let the ACC know before, I believe it's August 16th, somewhere in that range. So they're going to have to figure this out pretty quickly if they want to be in 2025. And if they don't, where are you going to end up? Because the SEC has said they don't necessarily have interest in either of them. I would say that will probably change as it kind of gets a little bit further down the road, but that's something that we'll see kind of unfold. But it'll be fascinating to watch that be kind of unfolding before our eyes, because the ACC, if they lose Clemson and Florida State, will be down to that 15 team number, which is kind of the bubble they sit on with the ESPN contract, and you can't lose those two without having a plan to grab some other teams, or it could mean the end of the ACC as we know it. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. And then, obviously, the Pac-12. This kind of predicates on the ACC and how they go about business, because I do think the Pac-12 is going to go out and add some Mountain West teams, get to that 8-team number that would be considered a full conference by the NCAA. Obviously, a huge moniker for the Pac-12 moving forward. But then you might just want to poach some ACC teams while you're at it. Obviously, some teams might just be finding their way out as this Florida State and Clemson thing kind of barrels down the tracks a little bit. So it'll be fascinating to watch this kind of unfold. I think the Pac-12 is in a position where right now you just got to get your head above water. You got to make sure you add those Mountain West teams, make sure you get to 8 teams total, and then you can kind of deal with possibly adding some ACC teams, possibly adding some different group of 5 teams, or merging with another group of 5 to make kind of a power conference in the group of 5. So there's a ton of different moves that can happen with the Pac-12, but it feels like a lot of the decisions are going to start happening here pretty soon. So I think we're going to have a crazy month here, or a crazy couple of months really, but I think especially in July, a lot of things are going to get kicked off, and I think the ACC and the Pac-12 will likely change pretty aggressively this month, or at least the prospect of them changing will become a lot more real this month. The other thing I want to talk about is recruiting. Obviously, we've talked about this a ton. June and July are the months. It used to be December through February was when the classes kind of took shape. That's no longer the case. It's usually right before that senior season of high school. They kind of want to get all this out of their way and move forward. And that's something that I expect to happen this time around as well. 6 of the top 10 players in the country are still uncommitted. I don't think that'll be the case in about 2 weeks. I think that'll probably be cut in half, if not more. So I think we'll hear from a lot of the top guys in the class, and also of the top 30, of the top 20, there's a lot of guys that are uncommitted. So a ton of classes are going to get some big boosts this upcoming month, and it'll be fascinating to see who gets the big boost. Kansas State, obviously, in this picture, got a huge commitment from a 5-star Lincoln Core, a really, really talented tight end. I believe the number 1 tight end in the country, if I'm not mistaken. So a huge commitment there. Obviously, some teams picking up pace with Bama and Georgia and Ohio State and Oregon kind of leading the way there. Penn State's done a great job in June. So it'll be fascinating to watch that kind of unfold. That's going to be something that we'll have to see who kind of comes out on top this month, because it's usually whoever comes out on top in July is the one that's going to win the cycle overall. So it'll be fascinating to kind of watch the commitments roll in over the next couple of weeks. But also, one of the big things happening is media days. As we all know, this is something that every offseason we kind of gear up for, get excited for, because we finally get to hear from a lot of the players, coaches, all the commissioners that we want to hear from at the SEC media days, at ACC media days, at Big 10, Big 12, wherever you're kind of interested in. There's plenty of things that come out of this that are really interesting, and it'll be really awesome to kind of watch this unfold over the next couple of weeks, especially with a lot of the realignment stuff going around. This is obviously something that's going to be a huge topic of conversation, and that guy right there, Jim Phillips, absolutely has his work cut out for him in the ACC. They're going to have to figure out a ton of things, and frankly, I think a lot of that stuff will likely come out during the media days. You have a lot of people interacting that usually don't interact, and you get some quotes that you wouldn't normally get. So I definitely think that's going to be something that picks up steam over those couple of weeks. The 13th through the 27th is every big conference meets between those 2 weeks. And there's going to be everything you can think of, whether it's realignment or house settlement talks is absolutely going to be a huge part of this, or you're going to have rule changes possibly to some of these different things. You'll get a better idea of how the helmet communication is going to work and that type of deal. So tons of stuff to break down from these media days, and that obviously will add to the intrigue going on during this month. And then finally, obviously, College Football 25 is coming out this month. It's one of the biggest days of the year for a lot of guys out there, including myself. It'll take me right back to when I was 12 or 13 years old and played that for just hours on end. So obviously very, very excited. Releases on the 19th, so just cannot wait for that day. We'll jump into overall rankings later. Obviously have a little bit of an issue with some of the different rankings that were given some teams, but overall we're a little bit closer to this game coming out, and that's always a great thing. I believe we're only a little bit more than 2 weeks, so not too far from now, we will have this game in hand and be ready to roll. So cannot wait for that. We'll likely do a top 10 of the teams that I'm looking towards doing a dynasty on next week, so be on the lookout for that. I'll definitely break that down. No Power 5 teams, obviously. That's not the way that I want to start my dynasty, but overall, I think this is obviously going to be a huge thing for gamers all over the place, but really just college football fans, and especially ones around my age who had this game growing up, and then it went away kind of very quickly, and you lost all the great moments that you had when you were a little bit younger. And obviously now that it's coming back, it could not be more excited. So it's going to be an awesome game. I think it's one of those that is going to really create so much energy around the college football world going into this season, and it's really just going to be an incredible thing to watch all of the content come out from it, and all of the people start to play it maybe for the first time, and everything in between. So just cannot wait for that. But overall, July is going to be absolutely insane. Let's just be totally honest. It's going to be one of those months that I think we remember for quite some time in college football. Not necessarily because of the recruiting or even because of College Football 25, although that's going to be an incredible day for a lot of people. that happens, recruiting obviously happens every year. Media day is the exact same. So that's not necessarily overly special in the month of July, but there's a lot of stuff to talk about this month. Whether it's conference realignment, the House settlement, you'll get a lot of details over the next month because of those media days and because of the conversations between some of the biggest people in these conferences. So it'll be fascinating to kind of watch that unfold. I think a lot of news about the student athlete pay and how that kind of is going to roll out will come out over the next month, and obviously we will cover it as it comes out. And it's going to be absolutely insane to watch all of this stuff roll out in pretty quick succession here, whether it's the video game or recruiting or everything in between. The coaches are going to have to juggle a lot, and frankly we're going to have to juggle a lot as we get into this season, because there's going to be a ton of things that kind of roll over the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks that really affect the next 2 or 3 years in the sport, whether it's Florida State and Clemson finding their way to the SEC or the Big Ten or a mix between the two, whether it's ACC teams following them and leaving the conference and the Pac-12 possibly snapping some of those up. We could have an entire shift of power where the ACC falls out of the Power Four and the Pac-12 jumps right back in. So a ton of stuff could obviously happen over the next little bit. I think some of this stuff will be a little bit longer term, obviously, but there will be a lot of news. There's no two ways about that, and it'll be fascinating to watch all of this unfold, because this is going to be one of those months that I think we remember for quite some time, like that 2021 July where Texas and OU, it broke that they were going to the SEC. It feels like something like that's going to happen around the ACC or around the Pac-12, and we'll remember it for quite some time. So it's going to be incredible to watch all of this unfold. Obviously, July has become one of the biggest months in the sport. Even though there's not football being played, there's plenty happening around the sport, and this one feels like it might just be more intense than usual. But we'll definitely break it down as it comes, obviously give you every update that you need to know. But let's take our first break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about Marcus Freeman and Notre Dame. It feels like they're heading even more in a right direction than they were under Brian Kelly, which was a pretty good team for a long time. So we'll break down what Marcus Freeman is doing right and how I think they might just take their national championship odds to the next level this year and the coming years, in the next couple of years, obviously. So we'll break that down after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows with 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the month of July and how I think it's going to be a crazy one around college football. Whether you want to talk about conference realignment or recruiting or the House settlement or college football 25, there's going to be incredible stuff happening all across the sport, and it feels like one that's going to define the sport for years to come. So definitely we'll break down all of the stuff that you need to know as it kind of unfolds this month. But let's get into Notre Dame and let's break down all of this stuff that has happened over the last couple of years since Marcus Freeman took over for Brian Kelly. Obviously, as you remember, back in 2021 with that absolutely crazy coaching cycle, Brian Kelly made his way down to Baton Rouge to coach the LSU Tigers, and a lot changed in Notre Dame very quickly. They had some staff changes, obviously, but they kept the most important guy in-house, and that was Marcus Freeman. That was one of the reasons that Notre Dame fans weren't quite as broken up as you probably would be if you lost a coach like Brian Kelly. It's because they knew this guy was right in the wings, ready to take over. And he's done just an incredible job over the first 2 years. Obviously, have had some hiccups here and there. Obviously, losing to Marshall is not necessarily the way that he wanted to start his tenure, but a 9-10 win season to start is about as good as you can ask for. And obviously, a lot of things had to be figured out there. The biggest among them was the quarterback position. That has not been necessarily Notre Dame's strength by any means over the last little bit. It's been something that's kind of held them back over the last couple of years, and that started to change pretty much the second that Marcus Freeman walked in the door. It felt like the recruiting took it up a notch, but also going into the portal and finding some guys while they wait for the recruiting battles to kind of reap the rewards of these quarterbacks that they might just be winning over in the recruiting world. But obviously, bringing in Sam Hartman to last year's team was absolutely huge. It gave that team some confidence. It gave that team a steady hand at the helm, and obviously didn't necessarily have the season that they expected, but had a really, really solid season and got better from a year ago, especially on the defensive side of the ball, and did a lot of really good things. And I think a lot of the worries that I had about Sam Hartman throughout the year last year had a lot to do with some of the wide receiver talent that was on that team. So I think this obviously is going to be another step forward this year, and they got another guy that's going to be incredible leading them. Riley Leonard is one of the best quarterbacks in the country. When he was healthy at Duke, he was just absolutely incredible and runs an offense really, really efficiently, and definitely someone that they can entrust to run this offense really effectively. And I think he's likely on kind of the same wavelength as Sam Hartman. Obviously a better athlete, so different styles of play, but I do think he's going to give him really good play. I also think they have better wide receivers than they did a year ago, so that obviously raises the floor of what this kid can do this upcoming year, and the floor is already really high for someone like Riley Leonard. So really, really like him. I think he's someone that definitely can bring Notre Dame where they want to be, which is in the playoff and possibly competing for a national title. But frankly, I think it gets better after that. I think CJ Carr is the start of that. If you have heard really anything out of Notre Dame over the spring or the summer months, you've heard about this kid because he is everything that they talk about. He is as, highly touted of a guy as I've seen at Notre Dame in quite some time. I think he's someone that the ball just explodes out of his hands. Everything is very, very comfortable for him, and I think sitting behind Riley Leonard for a year is going to be hugely important for his development. But also, right after CJ Carr, they'll have Deuce Knight waiting in the wings, and this is one of the best quarterbacks in this class. Obviously, someone that will be huge for them, and definitely someone that can do just about anything you need him to do. The arm is absolutely ridiculous on this kid. He's a little bit more of a dual threat than CJ Carr, although not necessarily his biggest trait. His biggest trait is obviously that arm and just how impressive he is with it, but it's insane what he's been able to do, Marcus Freeman that is, in bringing in some of the quarterbacks he's been able to bring in and will be able to bring in over the next couple of years. And I think it's the last rung of the ladder for Notre Dame. They've done a lot of really incredible things when Brian Kelly was there and in the years since, but they got to get over that next hump. And the quarterback play has been kind of the thing in Notre Dame for quite some time that has held them back just a little bit. But Marcus Freeman is doing everything in his power to make that not a problem going forward, and he's doing a great job across recruiting. Deuce Knight is obviously a huge piece of this, but he's had top 12 classes and he's going to get to a top 5 class over the next, couple of years. Currently sit number 4 in the country this class with Deuce Knight in it, and also brought in guys from the portal that are absolutely huge. Chris Mitchell being probably the main among them at wide receiver. Absolutely huge player that they brought in, someone that they're going to need to play absolutely huge for them. And also, the back end of this defense is always going to be really good. They're bringing in tons of guys in this recruiting class that are just going to be elite college football players, and as long as you have Marcus Freeman on the staff, he's going to be able to bring in those guys. There's no doubt about that. But also, the probably biggest move that they made this offseason is hiring Mike Denbrock back. Obviously, this is someone that did just incredible things at LSU a year ago. Jaden Daniels and him kind of teamed up for what was one of the best offenses we've seen in quite some time in college football, and it's obviously something that Notre Dame wants to happen up there. Now, I don't necessarily think they're going to be the 2023 LSU or anything like that, but I do think they're going to put up more points. I do think they're going to be more dynamic, and I do think they're going to be a little bit scarier of an offense to deal with up in Notre Dame for as long as he's there, really. I think they're going to be a team that is likely going to live off the run a little bit more than LSU did a year ago, but also you still have that quarterback run game that you can kind of play around with. Obviously, it won't be quite as dynamic as it was with Jaden Daniels because not a lot of things are, but Riley Leonard is more than capable with his legs and absolutely can make some big plays. So this Notre Dame team in the past couple of years has been a team where if they catch the right team on the right day, they can put up a really good performance, but they're winning games, 24-10 or 17-14, although they lost a game to Ohio State 17-14 this past year. But regardless, I think this hiring gets them to a place where maybe they win some games 38-35, or better yet, 38-14. So I think they're going to be a team that is going to be scarier on offense pretty much across the board. I think the run game is going to be a Notre Dame run game. They're going to have a good offensive line. They're going to have a good running back, and Mike Denbrock can absolutely call some run plays. But I do think the passing game is going to take some steps forward, not only this year, but over the next couple of years. I think this is one of the most impactful hires over the last, or really over this offseason. Obviously, DeAnton Lynn over at USC, Tim Lester at Iowa are going to have huge, huge things to kind of live up to and fix, really, in their two places that they're at. But Mike Denbrock might have the biggest effect this year, and honestly might have the biggest effect going forward for this team just because of how good he is. So obviously, this is going to be absolutely insane to watch Notre Dame kind of develop into the team that they've been capable of being for quite some time, but bringing in some of the offensive talent that they've brought in over the last 2 years, and especially this offseason, has just been absolutely incredible and definitely can take them to that next level. And then finally, obviously, the 12-team playoff definitely favors Notre Dame. Let's just be honest, they play a schedule that is pretty manageable most years. It's not necessarily super easy all years. This year is definitely manageable. There's no two ways about that. They can definitely handle this schedule and go undefeated against it. There's no two ways. I mean, they absolutely can beat A&M in the opening week. They absolutely can beat Florida State later in the year. And beyond that, you do have Louisville. You do have some other teams that you might have to worry about a little bit. But overall, Notre Dame's going to just be more talented, be more physical than most of the teams on their schedule. So it'll be fascinating to kind of watch that unfold. But I promise you, Notre Dame did not sign this playoff agreement without knowing what it was doing. They knew that they were going to get into this 12-team playoff most every year as long as they handled their business. I think I've talked about it on here before, but if they don't go at least 10-2 this year, they shouldn't even be thought about going in. And frankly, if they don't go 11-1, I'm not sure if I would have them as a top 12 team in the country. Because of that schedule, it's not necessarily the gauntlet that they usually face. So I'm not necessarily super bullish on this team, being able, if they go 9-3, I definitely don't think they should be in. Even if they go 10-2, I think that depends on what everyone else is doing around the college football world. So this obviously is a team that is capable of being a top 5 or 6 team in the country. They can do just incredible things, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. It's going to be an incredible group led by Xavier Watts, Howard Cross, Riley Mills, a lot of really, really talented players on that defense, even losing some really, really talented players like J.D. Bertrand from a year ago. So I think they're just going to be an incredible team pretty much across the board. And a lot of that has to do with the head guy, Marcus Freeman. It feels like the second he showed up, a lot of things changed around there. And it wasn't necessarily to say that Brian Kelly was doing a bad job. Obviously, he wasn't. He was doing an incredible job up there. But it feels like there's a gear that has been hit up at South Bend that just hasn't really been there over the last, decade or so. And particularly on the offensive side of the ball, it feels like a lot of the things are starting to find their place up there in South Bend, especially at the quarterback position. So it'll be incredible to kind of watch this team develop over the next couple of years, because Marcus Freeman walked into what is one of the biggest jobs in the country, one of the most high-pressure jobs in the country, and has answered pretty much every bell. Obviously got off to a little bit of a rough start in year one, but recovered really nicely from that, and then year 2 was a little bit better. I expect year 3 to be a little bit better than that, and then you're off running, and a lot of things can happen coming over the next couple of years for the Irish, and I think they're just going to be a really, really good team, pretty much year over year. I think the defense is almost always going to be good with Marcus Freeman calling plays and doing some of the things that he does on defense, but also the offense is just slowly getting better. I do think they need to keep taking steps forward at the wide receiver position in recruiting and in the portal, but regardless, this team has taken the big step forward that they hadn't for quite some time, which is get elite quarterbacks on your roster and let the rest of it kind of fall into place. So obviously adding Sam Hartman a year ago made them a much better team than they would have been. Riley Leonard this year, the exact same, but CJ Carr and Deuce Knight, I think, is where the show really starts, I guess. I definitely think they're capable of doing some stuff this year that will be really impressive, but I think if they're going to lift a national title while Marcus Freeman's there, it's likely going to be under one of the 2 quarterbacks that are coming up over the next couple of years. So it'll be fascinating to kind of watch this unfold. Marcus Freeman's one of those guys that every time you hear something new about him, you get even more excited about what this guy can be in college football, and he's at the right place for it. There's going to be tons of eyes on him and his team, and if they can, meet expectations this year and the coming years, they're going to be able to lift national titles. There's no two ways about that, whether it's overall recruiting, whether it's, portal recruiting, or just everything in between, coaching moves and all of that stuff. It feels like everything is just moving in the right direction for Notre Dame, and they're already in a really good spot. So a lot of things can happen very quickly over there, and they are one of the teams that absolutely can win a national title this year. So it'll be fascinating to watch this team this year, but also over the next couple of years with Marcus Freeman at the helm. But let's take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the playoff and talk about maybe the SEC and Big Ten do not get what they want from this playoff. Maybe they don't get all of the teams that they want in and absolutely dominate the field in this playoff. And what happens after that will be a very, very interesting thing to watch. So stick with us, and we'll be right back with that.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about Notre Dame under Marcus Freeman and how a lot of things are happening up there that haven't necessarily happened over the last couple of years, and it feels like they're hitting just another gear up there in South Bend, and that's a pretty scary thing for all of college football, that's for sure. But let's start to break down this playoff and talk about the SEC and the Big Ten. Obviously, when this playoff agreement was signed, it was the SEC and the Big Ten kind of running the show. They were the ones kind of making the decisions as this unfolded, and they were the ones that got the biggest piece of the pie, whether it comes to revenue or the number of teams they're likely to get in or everything in between. The SEC and the Big Ten came out of this feeling very good about the way that they were going to go into this new playoff, but the question becomes, what happens if they don't necessarily get what they want this upcoming year? What happens if they don't dominate the playoff the way that they're expecting and get 7, 8, maybe even 9 teams into this field and absolutely dominate what they want to dominate, which is the postseason in college football? And there's tons of things that can obviously happen with this. When you talk about college football in pretty much every conference, there's a couple of different paths that they can take. There's a couple of different ways that conferences can shake out, whether it's, cannibalism and everyone kind of eats each other up and it doesn't necessarily get very far. No one has that elite record at the end of the year, or you have some teams just leave everyone in the dust and have a couple of teams that are at the very top, 11-1, 12-1, what have you, and then you have a couple of teams that are 8-4, 9-3, sitting a little bit on that kind of bubble for the 12-team playoff. So it'll be fascinating to kind of watch this unfold, but I think there's going to be so many things that kind of happen around this over the season, and obviously the SEC and the Big Ten are going to be a huge topic of conversation. They are the ones that, they're the best conferences, just plain and simple. They are the 2 best conferences in the country, and they're definitely going to be the best teams in the country in those conferences. I would make a really good argument that probably about 8 of the top 12 teams in pretty much any year are going to be from these conferences. The question is, does that kind of match who gets into the playoff? Because this is going to be a battle across the 12-team playoff where you have to compare these conferences with the, lower level conferences, if you will. The ACC and the Big 12, you're going to have to figure out how they kind of match up with each other and how that all works. And it's going to be fascinating to watch. But obviously, as we talked about, there's 2 paths for every conference, and the SEC and the Big Ten could follow either of them, really. Texas and Georgia are the teams that everyone's pointing to in the SEC. They lead in the odds to win the SEC and win total in the SEC, so they're the teams that absolutely everyone is watching, and they absolutely could be the teams that pull away from everyone. They could be 11-1 at the end of the year, and one be 11-2, one be 12-1 after the SEC championship, and everyone else is like 9-3, 8-4, kind of in that pack that it's going to be a little bit confusing for them. You could also have, Ole Miss or Bama be in this group. Absolutely could leave everyone in the dust, whether it's with UGA or with Texas or with each other, Bama and Ole Miss at the top of the conference. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. Those are obviously the teams that everyone's kind of watching as we get into the SEC. And then in the Big Ten, it's Ohio State and Oregon. These are the teams that everyone's pointing to, and the same exact thing could happen, whether it's Ohio State and Oregon absolutely pulling away from everyone, going 12-1, 11-2, or maybe Michigan joins that group, maybe Penn State joins that group, but those 4 teams kind of stand above everyone else just a little bit, and definitely will be the teams that, if this was going to happen, if there were going to be 2 teams that kind of pull away from the pack, those are likely going to be where they come from, those 4 teams. So it'll be fascinating to kind of watch that unfold. But also, you have a couple other teams that are sitting kind of right on the outside, and what they do probably has more of a inkling of what's going to happen in the playoff, whether it's Tennessee. Obviously, they have a huge amount of expectations for this year. Missouri, OU, all of these teams are definitely looking at this year in the SEC as years that they can take what they want. They can get into the conversation to get to Atlanta. They can get into the playoff. They can do some of the things that Tennessee, Missouri, and not so much OU by any means, but Tennessee and Missouri especially have struggled to do, which is get into the playoff. Oklahoma, in the SEC, it's going to be a new type of battle, so it'll be fascinating to watch those teams unfold, but they're going to have a ton to say about how this all shakes out, and they could be 8-4 at the end of the season, they could be 10-2 or 11-1, and it'll pretty much decide the way this playoff breaks down. Also in the SEC, you have LSU and Ole Miss. LSU, more importantly, kind of sitting right on that bubble line. Whether you're the 5th or 6th or 7th best team in the conference, you're one of those teams that absolutely will have something to say about the SEC as a whole and the playoff overall. But it'll be fascinating to watch that. And then the Big Ten, you obviously have, Michigan and Ohio State are going to be 2 of the teams that everyone is watching this year. And then you obviously have the Iowas, the Wisconsins, the teams that absolutely can make some noise if they're going to, have a couple of things break their way throughout the season. Nebraska and USC are 2 other teams that I'm definitely watching for that, but they could be at 8-4 as well. They could be at 7-5, or they could be at 9-3 and 10-2. So it'll really decide the way that this is going to go in the playoff, because there's been this sentiment around the expanded playoff and the 12 team that we won't really have too many arguments anymore. There won't be this huge battle between the 2 entities of who's more deserving, who's the better team, all of these battles that happen in the 4-team playoff. I think they're going to be more confusing, if I'm being totally honest. I think there's going to be more teams at the 10-2, 9-3, 8-4 region, and on top of that, you're going to have to compare them to other conferences. It's no longer, being able to compare them to a couple of teams. You now probably have to compare pretty much every team across the country to 4 or 5 different teams, unless they obviously get the auto bid. That's a little bit different. But in the ACC, you could have Florida State and Clemson that make a ton of noise. You could have Virginia Tech and Miami that absolutely make noise. But all of those teams could go 9-3. All of those teams could find their way to Charlotte as 10-2 teams or 9-3 teams. And then you're having a conversation of, even if the person gets to a conference title, do they deserve to be in? Or the other way around, you could have all of those teams at 10-2 or 9-3, and you could have a really tight conference battle, and it could be fascinating to watch throughout the entire thing. And then maybe you have more teams that get in. So it's kind of a complicated thing where I don't really know which path makes for more teams getting in. I do think that a couple of teams totally pulling away from the pack and being 12-1 or 11-2 while everyone else is 8-4 obviously hurts the conference. But there is a reality where a couple of teams pull away, but there still is those 9-3, 10-2 teams that absolutely can litter the playoffs. So in the ACC, it's those teams: Florida State, Clemson, Virginia Tech, Miami, NC State, a ton of other teams. And then in the Big 12, you have Utah, Kansas State, Kansas, Oklahoma State, and ton more teams that absolutely can get to 9 or 10 wins. And then the issues would arise, where the SEC and the Big 10 got into this conversation to have more teams in and to not have to worry about the ACC and the Big 12 stealing some bids. But you do have to make that comparison, right? You do have to say, a 9-3 SEC team, what are they to a 10-2 Big 12 team? I would argue they're better, but you don't really know because they haven't necessarily played on a neutral field, and there's an argument to be made from both sides. SEC fans would say, we play in the tougher conference, we play the tougher schedule. We've done a better job of dealing with that schedule and getting to 8-4, getting to 9-3, getting to 10-2 than a team in the Big 12, and that would be a fair argument. Also, if you're a Big 12 or an ACC team, you could say we played the games in front of us and won as many of them as we possibly could, and we have a better record than them, and that should be what, holds the most water. And I think that would be kind of a fair argument, although I would kind of push back on that a little bit more than the other ones. But the reality is this is going to be something that has to happen. I think there's going to have to be some type of model put in place that, whether it's the BCS or the S&P Plus or anything in between, just figure out a way to compare these conferences against each other, whether it's how good is an SEC team compared to a Big 12 team or an ACC team, or maybe group of 5 teams absolutely come into this conversation with the ACC and the Big 12. How good is good enough for the group of 5 or for the ACC to compete with some of these bigger teams? And on the flip side, if the SEC or in the Big 10 don't dominate this conversation, what happens on the other side? Because these are the two power brokers in this sport. These are the two people that hold the most power and absolutely will define the future the most in this sport, whether it's snapping up new teams from the ACC or something that absolutely could happen, which is them picking up their ball and taking it elsewhere and playing. The SEC and the Big 10, if you think they haven't thought about breaking off from the NCAA, I have bad news for you, because they absolutely have. These are two conferences that absolutely are looking at all of their options over the next couple of years, and if they don't necessarily get what they want from the playoff, then they might just take their ball and go play elsewhere. And obviously, this doesn't necessarily entail that the playoff should bend their knee to the SEC and the Big 10 and give them as many teams as they want, but it is to say this is the real reality. It's obviously not ideal, but the SEC and the Big 10 didn't sign this deal to get less than 5, 6, maybe even 7 teams into this thing. They absolutely want to dominate this conversation and be the teams that win the national titles, as they have been over the last decade or so, and be the teams that absolutely dominate this conversation. So it'll be interesting to watch, obviously, whether it's maybe the ACC and Big 12 have absolute battles and everyone's 10-2 and 9-3, while the SEC has Texas and UGA breakaway, or the Big 10 has Ohio State and Oregon break away from the pack, and you create kind of a really confusing conversation at the end of the day, where you're not just weighing a couple of teams against each other, you're weighing, a whole group of teams against a whole group of another, whether it's 5 against 5 or whatever that looks like. There's going to be a lot of comparison at the end of the year, and there's not a good answer by any means of who's the better team, who's the best or most deserving, or however you want to cut it in the new playoff. There's going to be arguments, and there's going to be a ton of things that we're going to have to kind of digest over this year, whether it's the SEC and the Big 10 possibly being a little bit angry and taking their ball and playing elsewhere, or the ACC and the Big 12 kind of falling into oblivion, as the SEC and the Big 10 kind of want them to do in this new playoff, and not being the teams that dominate this conversation by any means. So it'll be fascinating to watch these conferences unfold. Obviously, the ACC and the Big 12 seem to be a little bit more competitive battles. Obviously, the SEC and the Big 10 are going to be incredible, but it does feel like the ACC and the Big 12 are a little bit more crowded, and I think that could create a situation where you have a 9-3 and 10-2 teams just across the board. Also in the SEC, you could have teams pull away. It'll be fascinating to watch these conferences unfold and how it affects the playoff, because it's not just going to have effects in 2024. It's going to have effects across the entirety of the sport over the next couple of years, whether the SEC and the Big 10 get what they want out of this deal. And it'll be fascinating to watch, that's for sure, because it'll have wide-ranging implications around the sport, and we'll likely define it for quite some time. But let's take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about College Football 25. The overall ratings were released for all of the teams, or at least the top 25 teams. I want to break it down because I do have some issues, as I had last week with some of the lists, so we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the SEC and the Big Ten and the playoff and how if they don't get what they want, if they don't get a ton of teams in the field, it could create kind of an uncertain future around the playoff and around college football as a whole. But let's get into segment 4 here and talk about the college football top 25 teams. Obviously, we talked about the list on Friday that came out, the hardest places to play, the top 25 offenses and defenses, and I had some issues with some of those lists. Obviously, did not necessarily love the toughest places to play list. I don't think Bama is the second toughest places to play if you take the team out of that stadium, which I think is the way it should be broke down. The offenses and defenses I had a myriad of problems with, but at the end of the day, it means we're a step closer to this game, which is obviously huge news. But let's get into the top 25 teams and just break down where everyone sits. And the top team in this game is the top team in the country, by my estimation. It is the Georgia Bulldogs. They're at 95, and they're the top team. I have no problem with that. Ohio State right behind them at 93. No problem with that either. Oregon, Bama, Texas right there. Again, those are the top 5 teams in the country, in my opinion, and will be the teams that absolutely will find their way into the playoff, and it'll be interesting to watch them unfold over this year. But then some of the issues start for this list. Obviously, Clemson being at 90, I think they're a very good team, and I think they absolutely are a team that can be up in this kind of realm this year, but going into this year, I would not have them there. I would have them somewhere in the 13 to 15 kind of range, and I'd have teams like Utah ahead of them, I think. I think I have Penn State. I think I had Michigan. A lot of these teams that I just think are a little bit better. I think there's a little bit too much leaning on the talent level of these teams. Obviously, Clemson is going to be an elite team from a talent perspective. LSU, the exact same. Miami on this list, absolutely the exact same. It doesn't change that these teams coming into the season have serious questions pretty much across the board, whether it's Clemson, not necessarily as much on defense. I shouldn't necessarily say across the board, but the offense is a worry. You have LSU where the defense is a big worry. Miami, just a ton of transfers coming in that you don't really necessarily know how all of that is going to work out. So I don't necessarily love that. I don't think really any of those teams are top 13. I mean, they're all kind of in that conversation, and ranking these teams is obviously very tough, but I don't think I would have Clemson and LSU where they're at. I think I would have Miami just a touch lower, and these are obviously kind of nitpicky things, but overall I think it's just a little bit too much leaning on the talent level of a team and not necessarily what we saw from a year ago from that team. So it'll be kind of interesting to watch these adjust over the first couple of weeks. And then you have some bigger issues. And obviously, I'm going to surround Colorado here. It's no disrespect to Colorado. I got some comments on my video from yesterday. I promise I like Colorado. I promise I like Dion, but they're not the number 16 team in the country. Going into the season, they're just not. Coming out of the season, maybe they are. Maybe they shock me and a lot of people and, make their way up into that conversation, but they're just not the same team as Oklahoma. They're not the same team as Virginia Tech. They're not the same team as Kansas or Arizona or Oklahoma State. So I have a little bit of an issue with that. They were a top 10 defense, or a top 10 offense, in the game, which is insane. This was, I believe, somewhere in the 70s or 60s in total offense a year ago. They were a top 20 defense. Not even close. I'll be totally honest with you. A year ago, they were downright bad on the defensive side of the ball. And this year, although they've made some really, really good moves in the portal and absolutely have a much better defense than they had a year ago personnel-wise, they're not number 16 in the country. I can promise you that. They are not on the level defensively of an Oklahoma or an Oklahoma State, or particularly some of the Virginia Techs, obviously going to be a really good defense. So I do have a little bit of an issue with that. Definitely not going to be my favorite thing in the world, but also I understand the game that they're playing. If you want to, get Colorado early on in the game, absolutely you're going to get a really good team. And then when the season comes around, I expect that to start to drop just a little bit. But overall, I do think this is going to be probably a beneficial thing for this game, because it's going to get a lot of people playing it. That's for sure, because they want to play Shedeur Sanders, and they don't want to play with a team that is a 76 overall. They do want to play with a team that's 87. So don't necessarily hate on it too much, but I promise you they are not the same team that Oklahoma is. I can promise you even the Big 12 and everyone in Vegas is saying they are not the teams that Kansas or Oklahoma State are in the Big 12. So it'll be interesting to see that kind of adjust, but I suggest if you want to play as a really good Colorado team, you might just want to do it early on in this game, just before the season starts, let's just say. But some other small issues, I don't think Wisconsin's on OU's level. I don't think USC is. Michigan, to me, should be a little bit ahead of Penn State and Utah, as should Notre Dame above Clemson and LSU. But although those are kind of, nitpicky things, maybe I would move up Notre Dame to a 91. So it's really not all that much of a difference. But the biggest problem I have with this list, and the problem that I feel like everyone's kind of catching on to, but we should shine even more light on it, is did they just forget Tennessee existed? I'm not fully understanding how the conversations have gone in this room where they weren't on the top 25 offense list. They absolutely are a top 25 offense. They weren't on the top 25 defense list. They absolutely are a top 25 defense. They weren't on the top 10 toughest places to play in the country list. They absolutely are that as well. And they're not a top 25 team overall, and they are that as well. So I'm very, very confused what the conversation was around Tennessee. I am not a conspiracy theory guy by any means, but there's some weird stuff happening around Tennessee in the EA studios because I have no earthly idea what they were watching. I have no earthly idea what team they're looking at because this is a top 20 team in the country on offense, on defense, and overall. This is going to be a really, really good Vols team, and I'm very, very confused how they're not on this list. I'm just flabbergasted, to be totally honest with you. Neither is Missouri, as I just noticed, to be totally honest with you, and that's insane as well. So obviously there's some issues with this. There's going to be some issues with all of this stuff, and as it kind of unfolds, we'll obviously get some adjustments to this. That's actually one of the things that I really like about these rankings is you have a ton of teams kind of locked together. And obviously it looks a little bit weird right now, but you have 7 teams at 88 overall. You have 9 teams at 87. That does kind of give them the leeway to bump a team up a couple of notches or down a couple of notches, and these rankings to kind of take a little bit better of shape where you don't have a ton of teams tied at 88 and 87. You have, more teams occupying just one spot and not a lot of ties throughout it. So I do think that's probably a good way to go about business. Another thing I really like about this is there's no team that's 99. In 2014, Alabama was a 99 team. I really like that Alabama team. They were not a 99. And frankly, I don't think that really exists in college football. I think 2019 LSU is roughly as close as I've seen, and I would have them at probably an 87 or an 86 because of the defensive struggles they had. So I just don't think that should ever be a thing in this game, and very much like that they're getting a little bit further away from that as we get down the road, because you add a team that's 99 into the game, it's going to be a little bit less of a great experience when you're playing that team and they're just dominating you across the board. So I think that's obviously something that I really much like about this. I think by like week 3 or week 4, we'll have a little bit better of a consensus of how these rankings really are. You don't have a ton of ties at 6 through 8 and at 9 through, 15 and then 16 through 25. You have some variation in these rankings. It's definitely something that I think will happen pretty aggressively over the first, couple of weeks of this game rolling out. And it'll be really interesting to kind of watch that unfold. And obviously, this is going to be a game that everyone is incredibly excited for. But some of the rankings are just off a little bit, whether it's Colorado being a top 10 offense in the country or being a top 20 defense, or Clemson being a top 10 offense in this game, which they frankly just are not going into this season. They could be, obviously with Garrett Riley at the helm. There's tons of things that Clemson could do this upcoming year on the offensive side of the ball, but going into the year, they're not a top 10 offense. I'm not even sure if they're a top 20 offense, but at the end of the day, I understand this is not an easy thing to do. I understand they are working off, some sketchy waters because you're doing it before the season starts and you don't really know how these teams are going to develop, but overall, I just had some issues with some of the rankings and some of the ways that it was broken down. So minor issues at most, definitely not necessarily anything that will make me too mad at the game by any means, but definitely some things that I don't necessarily love. And they mainly revolve around, Colorado being a little bit propped up in these conversations, and I don't necessarily have too much of an issue with that because I understand who Colorado is, I understand who Dion is, and how important they are to this game and to this, being a big deal, but also they're just not, what they're rated in this game overall, and also just leaving Tennessee and leaving Missouri, those teams off these lists is just beyond insane. There's really no argument to be made that they're not better than most of the teams on that list, frankly. So I think that's obviously my biggest issue, is just leaving off two of the best teams in the country off your top 25 list and really having them nowhere to be found on most of the lists that they broke out. I believe Missouri was on the top 25 offenses, but overall, just ridiculous that those teams were left off, and definitely will be something that I think will likely be fixed throughout the season, with these rankings kind of updating and changing every day. So it'll be fascinating to watch this unfold. Obviously, it means we're just a day closer. It means we're just a little bit closer to this game coming out, and they're definitely getting people riled up, that's for sure. I think people are going to be ready to play this game, and I obviously am. So next week I'll break down my top 10 teams that I'm going to use possibly in Dynasty as I start it. No Power 5 teams. I want to start from the bottom and work my way up, obviously, so be on the lookout for that next week. But today we're going to do a little bit different of a Top 10 Tuesday. We're going to break down the best games in Week 0 and Week 1. We're about 56, 55 days out from this thing kicking off, and there's a ton of games to be excited about in the first couple of weeks. So I kind of wanted to get that excitement rolling, get everyone a little bit pumped up for this season. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the different things going on in the College Football 25 game, broke down the top 25 teams in that game, and some of the issues I had with those rankings, although all it means is that we're a little bit closer to this game coming out. But let's get into the segment 5 here today and break down a Top 10 Tuesday for you all. We're going to do the best games in Week 0 and Week 1 as I see it. There's a ton to break down in these 2 weeks. It's a really, really good start to the season. And I obviously have some honorable mentions before we start because there's a lot of games that we have to include here that might not necessarily make it into the top 10. You have Western Kentucky going to Bama. You have North Dakota against Iowa State. Georgia State going to Tech. UNLV at Houston. You have Fresno State at Michigan. All of those games are going to be really interesting to watch and definitely could lead to some upsets of some Power 5 teams or Power 4 teams as we get into the early parts of this year. But let's break into the top 10, and let's start with a game that I think is just fascinating. South Dakota State at Oklahoma State. These are two teams that have a ton going into this season, obviously on two different levels, with South Dakota State being the class of the FCS right now and Oklahoma State being a team coming off a trip to the Big 12 title and a lot of things riding on this year, a lot of hype going into this new conference. Oklahoma State is one of those teams that thinks they can just take over and definitely be the team in this conference. They absolutely are one of those teams. We'll see if that kind of finds itself in this year, and definitely a team that absolutely can do it. They are a team, although a year ago, that had some games that you just wondered what happened. Mainly the UCF game where they walked in with a team that really played into a lot of the things that Oklahoma State likes to do, including running the ball, and they didn't do much. They lost 45-3, got absolutely dominated at the line of scrimmage, and I don't necessarily think that's going to happen here. There's obviously a bigger gap between South Dakota State and Oklahoma State than there is UCF and Oklahoma State, but it is to say, you know, if Oklahoma State doesn't get a quick start and they let South Dakota State kind of get a couple of scores on the board, things could get interesting pretty quickly, that's for sure. But let's move on to number 9, and I have Colorado State at Texas. I think this is a game that frankly, Colorado State is a really good team. Just a really, really awesome team. And they're returning their quarterback, Braden Fowler Nicolosi. They're returning Torrey Horton at wide receiver, an elite duo that absolutely can cause problems for that back end of Texas defense that right now I think is going to be okay, but it might take some time to really get going this year. And if they do, this team is going to have their way with them. I'll be totally honest. And this is a game for Texas that really, if they want to be the team that they can be this upcoming year and absolutely, have every ability to be and want to be this upcoming year, they won't play with their food. They'll dominate this team by 3 or 4 touchdowns. They'll move on to the Michigan game, and it won't be much of a conversation. If Colorado State hangs around, there might just need to be a conversation had around Texas, where this has been a thing around Texas for the last couple of years, where they don't necessarily blow out teams that they should blow out. And it'll be fascinating to watch if this is one of those games or if they can kind of just handle business, move on to week 2 with that big matchup against Michigan and make everyone not worry. But definitely could be a game that causes a little bit of worry in Austin. But let's move on to the number 8 here. Virginia Tech at Vandy is a game that is a little bit under the radar. I think this QB battle obviously doesn't necessarily jump off the page, but when you have Kyron Drones against Diego Pavia, you have 2 guys that can make the offense by themselves, can do really, really incredible things in the run game and in the pass game, and absolutely will have a ton to do with what their teams are going to be capable of this upcoming season. So I think Virginia Tech is one of those teams that if they walk in, absolutely dominate Vanderbilt, we're going to have to watch them very, very closely as we get into this season because they are a very interesting team going into this season. But if they walk in and dominate an SEC team, obviously it is Vandy, but it doesn't change that they went into an SEC building, absolutely, dominated the team and walked out with a huge win. I think it's one that absolutely could define kind of that playoff conversation where if Vandy goes in and gives Virginia Tech a little bit of a battle, maybe they lean a little bit more in the SEC's direction. If Virginia Tech goes in and wins by 3 or 4 touchdowns, maybe the ACC teams win out at the end of the day when these conversations are happening. So that's kind of a under-the-radar game that could have wide-ranging implications for this year. But at number 7, I have Boston College at Florida State. This is a conference game, obviously, which gives it a little bit more juice. It is on that Monday night that has become kind of a staple around the week 1 in college football. I'm into it because it kind of gets me warmed up for that Monday night football game that's going to happen the week after. So definitely really enjoy that. This is a really interesting game because of the scheduling of it all. Florida State is coming back from Dublin where they will have played Georgia Tech. And there's going to be some questions. If they have won that game in convincing fashion, you're still going to have to deal with travel. You're still going to have to deal with a lot of the things that a lot of these players have never had to deal with in their lives. And then if you lose that game to Tech, you have a lot of questions, and you have to win this game and win it pretty convincingly to make your fans just calm down just a little bit. But let's break down another game, North Dakota State at Colorado. This is a Thursday night game in that week 1, and I think it's just going to be incredible. It might just be the most interesting one of this entire bunch, if I'm being totally honest with you, because this is a North Dakota State team that is not scared of anyone. They absolutely can walk into pretty much any building across the country and give a team a run for their money. And Colorado's a team that I think is going to be a good team throughout the year. I think is going to improve from a year ago, but they're likely going to start slower than they finish. They're likely going to be a team that gets a little bit better as the season goes on, and this would be the time to get them if you're North Dakota State. So this is obviously going to be a crazy game. If Colorado is going to be the team that they want to be this upcoming year and that Dion has said they're going to be, they're going to win this game comfortably. They're going to win by 3 or 4 touchdowns. We're not going to have to think about this one, but if this game one's a game kind of like that Colorado State-Texas game, you got some questions around Colorado, and it's some of the questions that a lot of people have going into the season, but they would be amplified, that's for sure. Let's get into the top 5 here, though. We talked about this game before. Florida State at Georgia Tech over in Dublin, not necessarily at Georgia Tech by any means. This one's going to be really, really awesome. And obviously the dynamic of them playing across the pond is obviously going to be a huge piece of this conversation, but also Haynes King is really comfortable in that Tech offense. You can't necessarily say the same thing about DJ. Now, I think he's going to be more than comfortable, and Mike Norvell does a great job of putting quarterbacks in great positions to succeed, but it does play a part in this game. Georgia Tech feels like they're coming into this season as the team they're probably going to leave this season as. They're a team that has a lot of guys coming back, has a lot of continuity on that roster and on that staff, and I think they're going to look like the team they're probably going to look like throughout the season. I think the defense will get a little bit better throughout the season, but on the offensive side of the ball, they're pretty much going to be a finished product from week 1, and Florida State likely won't be that way. So this is going to be a really, really fascinating game. Brent Key's going to have his guys ready for this one. I can promise you that, because he's not a guy that takes any of these games lightly. But let's move on to number 4. USC at LSU over in Las Vegas is going to be a crazy game. This is going to be as many points as you would like. They're likely going to score in this game, because these are two defenses that I think, as we've talked about a number of times, are going to be much better at the end of the year than they are at the beginning. I think this is the time to get them, and these are two quarterbacks that are going to be really good this year. I really like both of them, Miller Moss and Garrett Nussmeier, and they're taking over for the 2 top picks in last year's draft, in Caleb Williams and Jaden Daniels, and we still have a really, really awesome quarterback battle. So it gives you an idea of how good the offenses are at both these universities, and both these teams really need a kickstart, whether it's LSU jumping into that SEC schedule with the big win over USC, or USC joining the Big Ten for the first time and jumping in with a huge win over LSU. So both these teams need a kickstart if they really want to do what they can do this upcoming season, and maybe it just starts on that Sunday right after week 1. So it'll be fascinating to watch that game. Miami at Florida is number 3, and this one was really close to being put at number 2. I just think, this is two teams, well, Miami's a team that absolutely is looking at the playoff. Florida's a team that, with this schedule, is just trying to keep its head above water. If I'm being totally honest, it's going to be an absolute nightmare. But overall, I think this is a game that I think Florida needs. When you look at that schedule, it's going to be tough to get to 7 or 8 wins at most. If you lose this game, it's going to be tough to get to 6 possibly. So Florida might just need this game if they're going to be remotely a team to be worried about this upcoming year. Now, Miami on the other side absolutely needs a kickstart into the ACC race, and absolutely needs a little bit of that confidence boost. So both teams need this game a ton, but when I look at the schedule ahead for Florida, it feels like they really need this one, especially with this one being at home. So that will be a fascinating game. But number 2, Clemson at Georgia. This one's over in Atlanta. Definitely a game that everyone's going to be watching, and some of them are going to be watching to see Clemson go down and dunk on Dabo. Some people are going to be seeing it to see Georgia go down possibly, and a lot of this stuff is going to be really fascinating. But these are two huge teams, obviously, the two teams that took a pretty sizable bite out of the Bama dynasty, and they played to start the season in UGA's first title season in 2021, and UGA won a really, really gross offensive game that day, but overall, it's going to be an awesome one. And Clemson doesn't necessarily need this one by any means. They can do everything that they want to do without winning this one, but they got to show up. They got to show that they can compete with these teams, because if they walk in and just get beat by 14 points, 21 points, everyone's going to say they just can't compete anymore. Everyone's going to say that Clemson is done and the Dabo era is over in Clemson, South Carolina. It probably won't be the case, but regardless, that's what's going to be talked about. And then for Georgia, this is one you should likely take care of business. It's not going to be easy by any means, but Georgia's got to win this one if they're going to do what they want to do this season and going to be the team that they want to be, because they should dominate a lot of the teams on their schedule. But this is obviously going to be a tougher game, but they should absolutely win this one and walk into week 2 undefeated and just keep on rolling, really. And then Notre Dame at Texas A&M at number 1. I think this one really is just a notch above Clemson and UGA because of the venue. Them being in Kyle Field is special, and that's the way all these games should work early in the season, but that's beside the point. Also, a weird side plot is Mike Elko playing his former quarterback in Riley Leonard. So a lot of really interesting things going into this game. I think Notre Dame needs this one. We talked about it earlier. It's not necessarily the toughest schedule that they're going up against. They have 2 really big games in this one and Florida State later in the year. They're going to need both of them if they're getting into those playoff conversations. So I think this is one that you're walking into a really tough environment. You're walking into one of the toughest environments in the country, the toughest if you were to ask the people over at EA, and it's going to be really tough to win this one. But if you're a team that's going to go to a playoff and possibly win a national title, you would win it. But then if A&M walks away with a win, we got to start having a conversation about them, especially if Connor Wegman looks really incredible in this game. They're a team that could win the SEC. And I know that sounds a little bit crazy, but if Connor Wegman hits on all cylinders, it's a dangerous offense, that's for sure. So obviously, a ton of really incredible games in the first couple of weeks of the season, and it'll be incredible to watch them all unfold. I think there's a couple that are just a little bit of those kind of upset alerts that kind of happen early in the season, but also just some really, really classic matchups. You have Miami at Florida, you have Clemson at Georgia, you have USC, LSU, just so many great games that are going to be surrounding these first couple of weeks, and will definitely get us kickstarted into what's going to be an incredible season with so many awesome weeks. Week 2 is awesome. You have October 12th is maybe the best day of football that has ever existed, if I'm being totally honest. So it's going to be an incredible year, but we're going to get kickstarted pretty fast here. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages you could possibly need for all of the content you could possibly need around the world of sports. We have you totally covered. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.